Imagine, if you will, those 3 a.m. thoughts about time, space, or the odd and unusual things. These are not your everyday topics. These curiosities about the world and us seem more fiction than fact. This is a journey of enlightenment on subjects that fascinate the mind. Our findings may not change your views or beliefs, but let us share what we have researched along the way. Buckle up as we show you what we've discovered down the rabbit hole. Hey guys, welcome to What If Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm Will.
And I'm Terry.
And today we're going to sidestep our normal programming, very similar to what we did a couple episodes ago. And we're going to talk about my journey into, quite literally, what is referred to as the occult.
I'll tell you what, if I could say something.
By all means.
I am totally stoked that you're doing this because I know you're into this stuff and I've known about it for a long time, but I don't think you've ever sat down and told me how you arrived here. So like I'm curious as hell. I want to know.
I guess it'll be a learning experience for everybody. Then.
Yeah, totally. I think it's great. I'm stoked.
So let me just start at the beginning, right? As a child, much like you were raised in the Christian faith, where you were raised Catholic,
right.
I was actually raised Methodist. For those of you who may or may not know, it's just a different sect? Is that the right word? Sect of the Christian religion.
Yeah.
And, as I'm sure you were, we went to church like on a regular basis, Sunday school, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it just never really felt right.
No.
Now, not that it's a bad thing.
No.
Right? It just, for me, never really resonated.
Yeah. I get it. Same for me.
And interestingly enough, I think, I grew up Northeast Pennsylvania. I was a farm boy, so spent a lot of time outdoors. I'm very much an outdoor enthusiast, so I always felt more comfortable outside.
Yeah.
Just in nature, in the woods, kind of, I don't know, I guess that was my comfort space, so to speak. Like, it's just where I felt the best.
I'm the same way, except for the summer. I don't like being outside in the summer.
You know what? It can get really hot.
Yeah, but this time of year especially, I love being outside in the woods.
100%. The fall.
Yeah, the fall.
Beautiful. Winter can get a little frosty, but even then, I still like being out.
I'd much rather do that than be out there on a 90-degree day.
Sure. As a child of, I'll call it the late 80s, and I did most of my growing up in the early 90s, I had access to the early internet, early consumer internet for you nerds out there, right?
Right.
So, unlike your journey, I had a little more access to various references.
Right. Yeah.
And I think I was probably around 12 or 13 when I decided I needed to find a different path to what I now refer to as just overall spirit.
Right.
There's on the internet in the 90s, it was the pre.com boom. It was just starting there.
Right.
And everybody and their brother had a website.
Right.
In the later days, it was MySpace. But tons of information available, right?
Right.
So I found there are so many paths to what I have come to refer to as spirit. And not just, your basic ones that you know of, right? Everybody knows the basics: Christianity, Judaism, Muslim, even Hindu is a big one. Maybe not so much when I was a kid, but certainly it's, in Northeast Pennsylvania, our cultural pool has grown drastically.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think that's everywhere. I think everywhere it has.
Oh, definitely. But yeah, so I discovered a lot of different paths, and I did read up on quite a number of different paths, religions, if you will.
Right.
And was just kind of, I guess, looking for answers. I feel like probably somebody, everyone has a time in their life where they're just like, I have questions that are not being answered, and they go looking for answers.
Yeah, I think so. My journey into is the reason why I'm fascinated. My journey into not religion, but away from religion, maybe is a better way to say it to me. It led me to, in my experience, sort of being kind of an agnostic for 20 years, because I wouldn't say that I was an atheist because of, as I explained in previous videos, I've had paranormal experiences.
Right.
I've
So
had
that belief
interest.
of a higher power.
I
is
knew there
definitely
was something more than this.
Right. Right.
But I was at the point where I was just like, you know what? Whatever it is, if God's real, he's going to find me. And that's where I
Agreed.
kind of left it.
And so, you know what? Much like you, I always knew there was more, right? And I think kind of what steered me towards my discovery, my ultimate decision, really is basic logic,
Yeah.
and that overwhelming feeling of something more. And I say basic logic because, again, I grew up a farm boy, right? And you learn in school, even in elementary school, that like everything has life, essentially.
Right.
You know, the plants, the trees, the grass.
Right.
You know, we're not, animals and humans are not the only life forms, so to
Right.
speak, right?
And you know, we talk about things being connected. Everything is connected. Science says that too. It's called symbiosis. Everything lives according to the rules of nature with each other.
Sure, like just the
Right.
circle of life in general,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to actually, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but mental note, let's cover that in another episode.
I think we should.
right?
I think
Because
that'd be great.
the whole honeybee thing, or bees in general, was a big thing not that long ago in the news.
Right.
So stay tuned for that one, folks.
Right.
But yeah, so I came across this, I'll call it, you know what, it is actually recognized now as a religion.
Mm-hmm.
I came across Wicca.
Yes.
I'm sure most people have heard of it by now. It's been very mainstream, realistically, since the 60s.
Yeah. It's grown very much.
You
so.
know, you may or may not have heard of it called or referred to as witchcraft. Most followers, believers, what have you, do refer to themselves as witches.
Mm-hmm.
I've grown a lot since then. I would not refer to myself as a witch. And even my belief structures have kind of, I don't want to say strayed away, but certainly have changed since then.
I would say, me being an outside observer of you, I would say your belief structures have grown and augmented. You know, Wicca is like, you know, a definite foundation of sorts for you.
Sure.
But there's other things in there too. You know, it's kind of like, you know, with me being a musician outside of here. When I was a kid, I was a punk rock kid. That's what I listened to. That's what I played. That's what I was into. Everything else. But now I listen to everything. It's not that I still don't see myself as that kid with the mohawk.
Right.
But now there's other stuff that has come along to enrich that and make that stronger and better.
I feel like that's very much the average, I don't want to say average musician path, but certainly like you would expect to see a musician do that, right?
Right.
Where like you start into what you're into, what you know,
Yeah.
what you love. But then you do grow to appreciate and respect
Right, and that's everything.
other
That's,
forms of
that-
everything, right?
That's all everything. Yeah. I
So
would
in
agree.
my studies, if you will, I did learn a lot of history that I think I should dive into. Just kind of explain it. I don't know how many people actually know the history of Wicca, and respectively, it is a relatively new religion.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Right. It's actually only been, I will say, it's been mainstream since like the 60s, 70s era. The foundation, I guess you'd call it, it's kind of established, the basis was established only in like 1954.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Gerald Gardner is the one accredited of being like the father of Wicca. And so Gerald Gardner spent most of his career, and feel free if you want more research on Gerald Gardner, look him up. Great resources out there about that. But essentially spent most of his career in Asia. Western Asia, specifically.
Right.
Okay. And he picked up a lot of religious traditions and rituals and that sort of thing from the indigenous people there.
Right.
Additionally, he was also very well read and interested, so he studied a lot of the Western occult kind of things, right? And then with that, he was clearly influenced a lot by. This is why I wrote notes. See, because if I didn't have my notes, I'd forget the names of people that I want to talk about. So one of the big things was Margaret Murray.
Right.
So she wrote a book, long time. Actually, I want to say it. I don't even remember the year, but it was like a long time ago, and it's essentially the coverage, if you will. If there was a news story back then, it would be the coverage of the European witch hunt, witch trials, that sort of thing.
Right.
And she tried to actually capture everything and kind of describe what the cult, air quotes, of witchcraft was. And then another big influence on Gerald Gardner was Aleister Crowley.
Yes.
Which I know that you're very familiar with.
Absolutely.
Anybody who has listened to Ozzy Osbourne has at least heard the name.
I don't know if this is a little known fact or a well known fact, but the guitar player from Led Zeppelin, Mr. Jimmy Page, owns Aleister Crowley's home in England.
That's actually really interesting.
Yes. He sought it out to purchase it when he became famous and wealthy. He actually owns Aleister Crowley's house. I don't know that he lives there all the time, or it's just something he has to say, hey, I own Aleister Crowley's house. But yeah, he owns Aleister Crowley's house.
Wow. That's actually really cool.
Yeah.
So Aleister Crowley, right, very big into the occult, right?
Yes.
And so he even actually formed his own, we'll call it occult religion, so to speak. He was a member of one of the early occult organizations in London, I believe, called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
Yes. He was actually, from what I understand, too, a practicing alchemist as well. He was somebody who believed that you could change base metals into gold and things like that.
So it's interesting that you bring up alchemy, because I'm going to touch on that a little bit later.
Oh, cool.
Something I learned in my travels and journeys, so to speak. Travel meaning like not physical travel.
No, right. The rabbit hole.
Exactly.
Yes.
So Aleister Crowley, again, very big into the occult, and he had traveled to Egypt, and he actually wrote this book called The Book of Law. It's not really a book so much as I would call it a writing that is similar to a poem. It's sort of a work in progress is how it's defined. But it follows the formatting of a poem. So it has rhythm and rhyme and that sort of thing.
Right.
It's practically a jazz song.
Cool.
And so supposedly the entire work was dictated to him by a discarnate being that I know I'm going to butcher this name, but I want to say it's pronounced Awas.
Okay.
Which I thought was really interesting when I did learn that. Just, hey, you're talking to somebody who doesn't have a physical form. And given that I, up to this point, had also had, some paranormal experiences, I was like, okay, so it's a pretty normal thing.
There's a lot of that, actually. I mean, one of the big books that are out in the sort of spiritual community now, and it's not a new book by any means. I believe they were written in the early 80s, were called The Law of One, The Raw Materials. And I think it's a series, it's multiple books. I'm not exactly sure how many books are in it. I've read certain passages and excerpts from them. And once again, these were books that were written by researchers who, it's what they call the channeled work.
Okay.
Where psychic mediums channeled this information from a supreme being, a higher dimensional being, whatever, and it was transcribed into these books. Fascinating. I want to read all of them someday. getting time to do it, but I've seen a lot of stuff about them, and they're out there. You could check it out for yourself. There's a lot of cool stuff in there.
We should start a reading list.
We should.
Leave it in the comments if you would actually like to see a reading list from us. You know, just different works that we may or may not recommend.
Right. I think that'd be cool, actually.
Well, we would probably definitely recommend it if it's our reading list.
Yeah.
So maybe like stuff that we may or may not have read, and certain things that we certainly would recommend.
Yes. What he said.
All of that.
Yeah.
So getting back to Gerald Gardner.
Yes.
Because kind of got off on a Crowley tangent there,
Yeah.
but that was sort of probably Gardner's one of his big influences.
Sure.
And so Gardner moved back to England in the early 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And I can only say he claimed, because there are a lot of historians that believe his claims are completely false.
Right.
But he claimed to have discovered a coven, a group of practicing, witches. Technical difficulties. It happens, folks.
Sure. It's going to happen.
But he claimed to find a coven of practicing witches in 1939-ish in, I want to say it was New Forest, England, or somewhere in that area. And they took him in, and he learned their traditions, he learned their rituals, all of these things, right? And he took all of that information, and then he essentially founded the first coven and named it, not really named it, but the tradition is called the Gardenian Wicca.
Okay.
So that's sort of like the startings. And we're talking like, again, 1950s, like
Right.
54 as a matter of fact.
Right.
And, you know, there was actually laws in England at that time against witchcraft.
Ironically, believe it or not, there are still countries like Poland where being a practicing Satanist is illegal because there's still a somewhat of a theocratic element in their democracy. There's a documentary out there for any of you metalheads out there. There's a band called Behemoth, and they're from Poland, and their singer is he goes by the stage name of Nurgle. He is a well-known figure in heavy metal, and he's well-known in the satanic community. He's an absolute practicing Satanist, which everybody, when they hear that, gets immediately the oogie boogies, right? Like, oh my God, satanic worship. I used to, when I was a kid, being raised Catholic. Not that I've ever read the Satanic Bible. I have not. Another relatively new religion, as it were.
Sure.
Not since the 60s. Anton Crowley, the modern Satanism was founded by Anton Crowley in the 1960s. And it's really just spiritual nihilism. And what I mean by that is that Satanists don't worship the devil. They don't even believe there is a devil. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in anything. It's a totally secular practice. It's the certain people in the 80s that got a, not to get off on this tangent, but it got a really dark reputation with the practices of a few people.
What do you guys think? Should we have a whole episode on Satanism and just kind of, I don't want to say dispelling the myths, but again, just putting that information out there for people who may or may not be curious.
Shining a light on something that maybe nobody understood or knew. You know what I mean?
Sure.
We are not practicing Satanists, just so we're clear, and I'm not even fascinated by the subject so much, but it was something that was brought to my attention years ago, and I'm bringing it out right now. But once again, we're not going to go down that tangent.
No, definitely not. Well, not currently anyway. So back to the laws in England at that point in time. Mm-hmm. Laws against witchcraft.
Yes.
That did get repealed. So the minute they were gone, Gardner actually published a book called Witchcraft Today. Mm-hmm. And that was essentially the founding text of Gardenian Wicca. And again, that book was published in 54, mm-hmm. specifically. And Wicca in general sort of exploded between, I would say, the 50s and 70s. Like it got very popular in the UK and Europe, and then in the 60s and 70s, it really started to explode over here.
Right.
And you had all kind of sects, I would say, just pop up, right? Because everybody who is a follower and a believer of Wicca, much like your Christian religion, stays true to the basics, right? And then you have your different sects that have slightly different traditions,
Right.
different wording of the texts, that sort of thing. So you see stuff like Alexandrian Wicca pop up. You see the Farrier Anderson sect pop up. I think this one was super interesting. Late 60s, early 70s. There was I want to say it's pronounced Minoan Brotherhood.
Yeah, that's how I would say it.
Which was sort of geared to homosexual males specifically.
Right.
But even then, they're hitting that LGBTQ community there.
Mm-hmm.
And things certainly like progressed from that point, right? And then in that same era and progressing forward, you got a lot more resources. You got a lot more people in the public eye talking about it. Even though, again, the organization of Wicca is still super fairly new, but like happens with most things when humans don't understand it, they immediately fear it.
Absolutely.
Especially in the U.S. That seems to be a huge thing in the U.S.,
Yeah.
right? We tend to fear what we don't understand. We certainly don't like change.
No, and when it's in modern times also, the other thing is that when we fear something or whether we're against it or for it, we have a tendency here in the U.S. to try to politicize it and try to make, not that there's no politicization of Wicca that I'm aware of, but it just seems to be that's kind of the new thing.
Not currently. It was certainly a big thing in the 80s, actually.
Yeah.
Again, just on that tail end of the I will call it the growth spurt of Wicca. There was a lot of, I don't want to say political agenda, but there was certainly a lot of lobbying going on to have it recognized federally as a religion, and thus being covered under the First Amendment.
Yes, that's freedom of religion as part of the First Amendment. Yes.
I won't ever pretend to be great at that, at remembering all the amendments. So there are a lot of books that you can get. Like there is just a plethora of books that you can get, but there are always go-tos. When somebody decides or comes across Wicca, decides they're going to even just look into it. Maybe not like start to follow, become a believer, whatever, but even just starting to look into it, there are certain go-tos that I won't say everybody, but certainly most people would recommend. Probably the best-selling author of a Wicca book of all time is Scott Cunningham.
Okay.
And so he wrote a book called Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. Gerald Gardner's book is very much what I will say an original or an old tradition, something you would think about or probably have seen in a movie somewhere or something to that extent, because there are like roots and ties to old Celtic pagan religions like the Druids and so on.
Yes.
And so, Gardnerian Wicca tends to follow those trends where if you were interested in more information or joining a coven, as they're called or referred to, one, you have to know they exist.
Sure.
Right? And two, you have to be invited in. And then there's a ritual to, actually to have you join, that sort of thing. And then Raymond Buckland, another staple for beginners, if you will, as well as Scott Cunningham, both said, religion is just religion in general is a very personal thing.
Sure.
And I will go so far as to say even Jesus had said it. I'm sure somewhere in the Bible it is noted that you don't need a congregation or to be part of a congregation to worship God or, believe in, we'll call it the Christian God, right?
It's actually, if I may.
Go on.
When you brought up Jesus, Jesus actually did say that. It's not in the King James Bible that you and I have. It is actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the 1930s, I want to say, over in, it was maybe Israel, I think. And they believe that these Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them at least, they're written in Aramaic, which is a dead language. But they believe that some of these scrolls could have actually been written in the hand of Jesus himself. And these teachings that you speak of, Jesus did say, and there's a movie called Stigmata that's about this. Patricia Arquette and Gabriel Byrne, great movie actually, that talk about this. And the basic premise was that Jesus basically said, like you said, now he said it in a very, it's been translated from a dead language, and the way it was translated into Old English,
it was very much more poetic.
Yeah, I'm going to paraphrase the hell out of it, but he basically said, you don't need to go to church because I'm everywhere. God is everywhere. I'm everywhere. I believe it was something like split a piece of wood and you will find me, turn over a stone and I'll be there. You don't need to go into a man-made structure on a certain day of a week to find God or Jesus or whatever, because they're everywhere.
Sure. And that's what Ray Buckland and Scott Cunningham were getting at when they wrote their books. Now, Buckland wrote Complete Book of Witchcraft, which has a certain connotation that I want to talk about, but it is essentially the guide to Wicca in all aspects, whether you are looking to be a group practitioner, join a coven, that sort of thing. He does discuss a lot of the rituals, the holidays, the basics, and he also discusses you can do the same thing. Like he'll talk about this is how it works in a coven. This is how you do it on your own. Scott Cunningham, very similar, but a different methodology of not really. I don't want to say he compares them because I've only honestly read a little bit of Scott Cunningham. I just know he is certainly a staple, and I'm sure has a different point of view than Ray Buckland. Ray Buckland's how I got started, to be honest. There's only so much you can get on the internet, right? Especially in the mid-'90s with dial-up.
Right, and I imagine today it's just as bad the opposite way. There's probably millions and millions of outlets to go, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Go find.
I feel like everybody and their brother has written a book on either Wicca, witchcraft. You see, you know what? You see Druidism pop up a lot.
Right.
But I feel like it's a term they've kind of coined and started using as neo-paganism. Like, I want to say in the era that we know Druids existed, even though writing documents was a thing, I feel like that entire practice was more of a word of mouth kind of thing than actually writing things down. Right? Because you see a lot of, and maybe it's just because they are very similar, but you see the similarities. It's almost too similar to, various other, I'll call them occult practices or religions that I feel like it's very neo-pagan. I could be completely wrong because I honestly have not done that much study there.
I feel like when, to your point you're trying to make, I feel like when people say, like you just said, I could be wrong or whatever, the more I learn about I call it spirituality. I don't know if that's a good word or not to use for it, but the more I learn about religions, and I learn about especially ancient religions, and I learn about modern religions and how they equate and all these occult practices and all that, the one thing I keep finding out is A, they all seem to be connected on some level.
Yes.
And B, there's really no wrong way to do it when it feels right for you.
I agree with that.
And that's my opinion. I feel like you were saying before, your faith is very personal. And just like, just like your health is personal, and just like you as an individual and how you identify is personal, your faith is the same way, and how you practice it is the same way. That's my opinion. That's how I feel about it. I feel like basically you're only doing it wrong if it feels wrong to you.
I agree with that.
Right.
100%.
Yes. Continue.
So would you like to jump down this rabbit hole a little bit further?
I would. I'm interested, dude. I'm totally interested.
Cool. So we keep throwing this word around a lot, but when we throw this word around, we tend to use the Oxford Dictionary definition of occult, which is really just hidden or not easily obtained knowledge.
Yes.
Which is actually very accurate.
It is.
If you think about the usage of today, right? When the general populace talks about occult, they're usually referring to practices or even certain religions,
right?
Which is not actually that far out of the definition, right? Because despite the wealth of available resources on these things, not too many people are out there, who buys a book anymore? I'm sure there are a lot of people who still buy books. I am one of them. I
was gonna say I've
I like
recently.
to have a hard printed copy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I feel like you and I have like a collective soul. I think that's what it is. You know what I mean? Like we like to have the same thing. Like I'd rather have a record than a download. Obviously,
you can't beat the sound of vinyl.
I love it, and once again, that's an opinion, but there's something about having the physical item that,
agreed,
to certain people is an important thing.
Agreed. Interestingly enough, occultism, regardless of the practice, right? Whether it's Wicca, whether it's the thought I had is just gone. But essentially, you see it throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
If there is a human society, there has been occult practices.
Sure.
You know what? Since we live here, and nobody talks about it, right? And you kind of have to exist here to know it. And I'm sure you've heard about these because you're from this area. The what I'll lovingly refer to as mountain people of Appalachia,
yes,
very much have occult practices.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
There's all right, so the main things, right? Occult theories, and that's what it is. It's a theory.
Right.
And practices essentially are a thought process, a theology, if you will, where you use supernatural forces or beings to manipulate natural laws.
Right.
I mean, that's essentially what it is, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody says the same thing, that they can do things that mainstream science says, no, that's just not even possible.
Right.
And it may or may not actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of center around the practice of magic or divination.
Yes.
Which we just talked about.
Yeah.
Not an episode ago.
Right.
And so magic, I think this is interesting. And here's where, remember you brought up alchemy. Here's where I'm going to talk about that one. Because alchemy is so genericized today, I think.
It is. It's everywhere.
So magic is really it's a concept used to describe a mode of rationality or a way of thinking where you use the invisible forces to influence change or various effects.
Right.
whether it's on the material plane or, emotionally or mentally, you're essentially, using an unseen force or being to cause some sort of effect.
Right.
Which is kind of sounds familiar now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, we just talked about that on our first episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very much like a placebo effect or an intention, a power of an intention.
And interestingly enough, a number of anthropologists have literally argued that there's not a clear-cut line or distinction between what is magic and what is religion.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
I guess if you go with that base definition, I could totally see their point.
oh, sure.
And I'm sure someone out there is going to argue that point. And I want you to know your opinions are 100% valid, and we're not here to argue one way or the other.
Yeah, there's no right and wrong there. I mean, it's what you think, really. I mean, it's what you want to subscribe to
what
or
you believe
whatever.
in.
Right. I mean, I get it.
So the other main key of occult practices is alchemy.
Yes.
And again, I feel like alchemy is very genericized. Like, alchemy is so much more than what I will even call mainstream history. I feel like they just stop short on what alchemy actually is.
Right.
So yes, there is a portion of alchemy, and people who practiced and studied alchemy attempted to take base metals like lead or copper and turn it into gold and silver.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure they're still trying to do that today.
There are people that are trying to do that today.
But in addition to that, alchemy at its basis is changing something or preventing something. So a lot of alchemists back in the day were more focused on preventing or curing disease, right? And they're also trying to extend life.
Right.
And actually, alchemy was named in the 12th century, and it's actually a Latin, like European name. It's got its roots in astrology. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Essentially, its main attempts to discover the relationship between man and the cosmos.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And really, that's just another way of saying the different, the cosmos is also referred to as the heavens or stuff like that. Stuff outside of our understanding, basically.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So I want to jump into the term witchcraft, because if you look up occultism, which is probably everybody's go-to when they're researching this. I know I certainly did, right?
Right.
And they kind of refer to occultism, if you will, as like doing good, all the good stuff. But when you, and here this goes back to a lot of the laws in England, and actually we had laws the same for a number of years against the practicing of witchcraft.
Right.
So everybody has a negative connotation about witchcraft. Mm-hmm. And what we refer to as witchcraft throughout the history books was closer to what would probably be referred to as sorcery.
Right.
And the sorcerers of ancients, sorcerers, shamans, oracles,
Right.
they're all the same. And if you think about like a village, right, which is probably what you would see back in the day, right? Everyone had a sorcerer or a mage, and they were essentially the proprietor of their local apothecary.
Right.
If you were sick or had an issue or whatever, you'd go to your local apothecary, to buy your lotions, potions, powders, pills, salves, whatever. And it's essentially they were just trying to help,
Right.
And it's no different than... honestly, it's no different than if you watch Little House on the Prairie, which I don't know how accurate the representation of early U.S. Western movement is. But anytime somebody gets sick, if there was no doctor, who came? the minister,
Right.
right? Because if you don't have medicine, what's the best thing you can do?
Well, you're going to pray.
You offer a prayer of healing,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That was a big thing,
Sure.
right? And can I say, not to keep referencing this, but we brought that up in the Power of Intention video, where it's essentially setting an intention out in the universe and letting it do what it need to do. It's a prayer.
It is a prayer. And, to your point as well, I mean, we know in South America, Central America, the shaman are called medicine men, and they are their religious leaders, and they are their medical doctors.
Yeah.
They're one and the same. They call them juju. Well, Westerners call them juju kits, or they have like these, a box of herbs or, whatever they have that they use to perform their medicine. And indigenous people here in the U.S. even had, that a lot of them referred to their, lack of a better term, magic as medicine.
Right.
He has
right.
strong medicine. He can,
Sure.
It's kind of like you said. It's connected. There's a thing there.
I mean, the First Nations people had the same thing.
Sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Eastern religions, same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was super interesting.
It is super interesting. It's really cool, and it's kind of like I said. For me personally, I love hearing the story because, for one, I'm learning a little bit more about you. But for another thing is that it's just reaffirming what I've been looking into for the last several years about everything that's going on. And the weird thing is that the more you look into the practices of people's religions, people's spirituality, people's non-secular ideologies, the more you start bumping heads with real life, the more you start bumping heads with, of all things, science.
The more you start finding a connection.
Right. Everything, I'm becoming more and more convinced every day of my life that everything is connected, and everything, it has I don't want to say necessarily a singular purpose,
right?
But it seems to kind of go that way. And it's sad in a way because I see a world we live in where we're still very much wanting to have that Newtonian ideology of separation, and the quantum ideology, and it's the ideology of most religious practices, is
right,
that
right?
It's about being together. It's about being one, and not one like a hive mentality where you don't think for yourself or anything like that.
Sure.
But one in a spiritual and energetic sense.
Sure.
And like I said, my knowledge of Wicca, which by the way isn't even enough to really be dangerous, has always been its reverence to nature.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And I get that. I'm somebody who actually practices grounding. It's something that I learned from a Wiccan. And there's actual medical foundational basis for grounding. Taking your shoes and socks off and getting your feet in the dirt, in the grass, in the sand, in the mud, whatever, getting it into the earth. The practice of grounding actually has scientific merit. The earth releases negative ions through the ground. Negative ions are known to heal and repair cells in the human body. So when you have your feet on the ground is actually giving you negative ions through the soles of your feet. And it's a practice used by many Eastern medicine.
Not to continue down that rabbit hole, but I just want to point this out for you science nerds out there, the show me the proof people. Go on YouTube and look up Ben Greenfield. He did an entire episode on grounding. He lovingly refers to himself as a biohacker. Mm-hmm. And so I have no idea where he gets his money, but he has money, and he hears something cool and he will test it out on himself. And he does extensive testing before he talks about it. And so grounding was a thing that he did. And to this day, he goes everywhere with sandals on that have copper slugs in them. So he's always connected to the ground.
Nice. Now, if you live where we live, obviously, if there's a foot of snow on the ground in the wintertime, it's not very pleasant to go grounding. putting
Yeah,
your
it's
bare
probably
feet
not
in a
recommended.
foot of snow isn't very pleasant for very long. But even now, this time of year, I'll often go out in the backyard, take the shoes and socks off, just walk around in the grass.
Agreed. Just reconnect to nature.
Right. Just go for a walk. Get out in the trees. Get out in the breeze, man.
So talking about studying and finding connections, I know you know this little known fact, and I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers.
Oh.
Maybe not. I am an ordained minister.
Yes, he is.
I'm ordained through the Universal Life Church in Oregon.
Yes.
And so one of their largest beliefs is very similar to mine, or something I should say that I discovered, is there are many paths to what, again, I call spirit, and they're all correct. There is no wrong path.
Yeah.
However you get there is how you get there. Right. And that's sort of the foundation of what they've built. Their bumper stickers actually say coexist and have all of the insignias.
Yes.
And so since becoming an ordained minister, I felt like when you belong to the Universal Life Church and you're ordained in the Universal Life Church, you should probably know something about all of the religions. So I did go on like an actual religious study. When I say actual religious study, I didn't have a pilgrimage, but I did really start diving into the different religions. And again, there's that connection thing that I thought was interesting. So in the Western occultism practices, they have this theology of ancient secret philosophies that it's sort of a mixture of things. It's derived and kind of has roots in the Jewish mysticism. So for those of you who are not Jewish, there is the traditional Judaism, right? Just like Christianity, Muslim, whatever. And they're all like, here are the rules, here are the traditions, here are the things. And then there is a whole other section that is kind of providing the answers that are not covered in the Torah. And so they have the source text of Kabbalah that is essentially the doctrine of the Torah that covers the mystical things, an interpretation, if you will.
Yes.
And that is definitely a whole other subject that we could probably talk for days on. There are people who specialize and study these things. I would recommend getting your information from them. But if it's something you want us to look into, by all means, we'll do an episode on it if you would like. Additionally, there is the Hellenistic magic and alchemy, which it's sort of it pulls everything from the Hermetic principles that I know we've talked off camera about. I know you're very familiar with those.
I'm diving down that rabbit hole as we speak. The last couple of weeks, I've been dedicating a lot of my time to researching the 7 Hermetic principles.
I know you've done a lot more research on that than I have. I'm still growing in my journey. So you want to describe a little bit about those?
Well, fascinatingly enough, you were just talking about the Kabbalah and how a lot of its source texts were from, I'm going to mispronounce this.
By all means.
The Corpus Hermeticum. Is that it? Okay.
That looks right.
And there is a modern version of that was printed in the late 1800s, the late 1800s, early 1900s, called the Kabbalion, which you can't get on Amazon. And this book goes into greater detail about the 7 Hermetic principles. I do believe this is going to be a episode for us, the 7 Hermetic principles at one point.
I feel like we've described multiple episodes that we, if not already in the pipeline, have coming.
But the research I've been doing is it seems like every thing in spirituality all comes back to these 7 principles that we call them the Hermetic principles. They're actually more referred to as universal laws. And they're called Hermetic principles because they're named after Hermes from ancient Greece.
Okay, yeah.
However, when they were doing archaeological excavations in ancient Egypt,
right,
they found a sandstone tablet that predated Hermes by thousands of years that had these 7 these 7 principles written on them in ancient Egypt. And it was said that they were written by the Egyptian god Thoth.
So let me just stop you right there because I love leaving cliffhangers.
Oh, yeah.
So join us next time on What If Down the Rabbit Hole.
Right. Have a good one.
We've tried our best to provide all perspectives on these topics. If this type of content speaks to you or interests you, please subscribe to get notified when new episodes are released. Check out the show notes for all the references discussed. Do your own research, formulate your own opinion. Join us next time on What If Down the Rabbit Hole.